for younger readers, and a collection of short stories is six are for younger readers, and there's a collection of short stories. His novel, The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, which gives this session its title, has sold more than 11 million copies worldwide and has been adapted for cinema, theatre, ballet, and opera. He has many international bestsellers, including The Heart's Invisible Furies, which is a personal favorite, and A Ladder to the Sky. His novels have been published in 59 languages, making him the most translated Irish author of all time. He'll be in conversation with festival regular Jashodhara Chakraborti, herself an author, an alumna of LSR, Lady Shriram College, and IIM Kolkata. She writes, translates, and teaches a course on storytelling. So, welcome to both speakers. The session, as I mentioned, is Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. John Boyne discusses his timeless classic in conversation with Jashodhara Chakraborti.
Hello, are we audible? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you, Mala, for your very warm introduction. Um, I am obviously delighted because when you've been a fan of an author's for about 14 years and you get to meet him and you get to interview him, it's a rare, rare privilege indeed. So thank you very much, John, for being here. My first question to you is why did you choose to write it as a children's book?
Well, when I started writing Boy in the Striped Pajamas, I wasn't really thinking in terms of the audience at all. I had written three published novels to date, and they were all written with an adult audience in mind. I had never actually thought about writing for young people before. And I was probably about three or four chapters into the book when it occurred to me. I thought, well, because I'm writing about this, 9-year-old boy, this is a book for young people. And as soon as I thought it, I thought, well, that's fine. It didn't seem like that important in a way. I didn't change the way I was writing the book. I didn't change the language or the tone in any sense. But I had never, and I'd never written for young people before, but I hadn't read any young people's books since I had been a child myself. And in a way, when I look back, I think that was probably to the book's advantage because I was coming at it from a slightly naive point of view as a writer, because I didn't know what I suppose I call the rules of young people's literature. And because I didn't know the rules, I was able to break them and write it in a very original, I think, what I hoped was in an original way. So yeah, that was once I gave it to my agent and my publisher, I presented it as a young people's book, but I didn't see any reason why it couldn't be read by adults as well. And very quickly, it took off in both markets.
I think what I felt as an adult writing it. I mean, I didn't put my child hat on. Sometimes, as a children's author, I tend to do that and I tend to try and visualize it. But when I read it as an adult, I felt that as a children's book, um, the sense of foreboding is almost not there. And therefore, when you realize it as an adult, when you realize what has actually happened, it it's all the more powerful, which is something I wasn't expecting. Yeah. In the film, of course, the perspective, the point of view is different. Um, and I'd like you to talk about that a little. What made you take that call, or did you have a say in that call at all? Because
Well, of course, at the start, when the book was published, the original blurb on the book didn't tell you very much about it. And the original jacket, the blue and white stripes, it's only, I mean, when a book becomes successful, people know what it's about. And in a way, the negative thing is that because originally my idea was that you were going on the same journey as Bruno. And Bruno doesn't know where he is, he doesn't know what he's doing there. And the first readers of the book didn't know anything. And so it would only slowly dawn on them where this book is set, what's taking place. And as we slowly build up to the climax of the novel of what happens with Bruno and Shmuel, that it would come as a complete surprise to the reader. Now, of course, when you adapt that for film, at the very start, the first thing we see is Bruno running through the streets of Berlin and the swastikas hanging from the buildings. So you immediately know the setting that we're in. So it takes, in one way, it removes the that sense of innocence that's there, I think, at the start of the book. But there's nothing you can really do about that. But once the book started selling, people knew what it was about, and that was okay.
yeah, so in a sense, the onion comes a little bit peeled for you, um, uh, as opposed to the book when you read for the first time, which also brings me to a critique of the book that came up around the time saying this is not representative of the Holocaust necessarily. Although I don't think that was the point the book tries to make at all. It's not really about representation. So I'd like you to talk a
Sure.
little bit about that.
Well, firstly, a phrase that I don't like is the phrase a Holocaust novel. I've never really thought about the book in those terms. I think it's a book about friendship, first and foremost. I think it's a book about childhood and innocence and the connections that these two boys are able to make between them because they're both in a place that they don't want to be. They've both been taken there against their will. Now, granted, one of them is there under far more dark circumstances, obviously, than the other. But they are both 9 years old. They just want to be children. But the most important word, I think, in the book is on the front page of it, where it says fable. You know, a fable for me, a work of fiction with a moral at the center. That was always where I was coming from. You must remember, I was never thinking about this book in terms of it being a school textbook, a historical document in any way. It was a fable, a novel for young readers that I hoped would get them interested in the subject of the Holocaust, just as I had been interested in the subject since I was a teenager and I'd read very widely on it and become, I think, pretty well educated on it. But outside of that, it wasn't supposed to be a historical document. You know, the events in the book didn't take place. I changed some of the geography of camps in order to serve my story. And my first duty is to the story that I'm writing, not to anything else. So while I understand and have responded to some of the criticisms of the book over the years, which have gone up and down, like at the very start, it was very, very popular. Then it went through a period of time where everybody seemed to hate it suddenly. Then it went back to being popular again. And I mean, that's just the way it is with literature, I suppose, and books and the world we live in. All I can do is respond each time in the way that I do, which is that uh, I look back, almost 20 years later, and I do think that, a whole generation of children did start reading and learning more about the Holocaust in part, not entirely, but in part, because of the fact that they read The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And that, I think, in itself is a good thing.
So the book was, of course, as you said, a whole generation started, getting interested in the Holocaust. The book was phenomenally successful, and and then the film happened, and it must have changed your life. And I thought I'd ask you what changed for John Boyne, author.
Oh, it changed my life completely. I think of my life as before Bruno and after Bruno in a way. As I mentioned, I'd published 3 books before Striped Pajamas, and they'd sold okay, but they hadn't, done particularly well. And then this came along, and in the course of a few months, really, everything in my life changed. My book was being published all around the world. I was being invited to festivals like this all around the world. And then every book that I published subsequently, of course, then got more attention. And I continue, it's been almost 20 years of all I ever wanted was to be a writer. And once you are published as a writer, what you want is readers. And that's the most important thing it did for me. It gave me readers. That's here I am, in India, where I might not have been otherwise, and talking to a room full of readers about my work. I've tried to get better and better with each book. I don't think Striped Pajamas is my best book at all. It will always be the one that has sold the most. I think writers don't get an awful lot of books that really are just massive like that. I just as I came in, I saw Sebastian on stage, and Bird's Song is another one that everybody reads and everybody loves. And if you get one of those books in your life as a writer, you're really, really fortunate. But it gave me the foundation really to just keep working on my books. This afternoon back at the hotel, I'm working on the next thing. So I'm very
Which
grateful.
we'll come to, of course. So this is the first book, by the way, and about 14 years ago, I think I picked it up in a bookstore in Delhi, The Thief of Time, and loved it, and never thought I'd sit and interview the author one day. Um, I wanted to ask you about this dream of yours. You wanted to become a writer, and so many of us, me myself included, and many people sitting in the audience probably have had the same dream, because if you love books, you want to be a part of books in some way, shape, or form for your entire life. You, however, are one of the authors I know who actively went in and did a master's at creative writing. Um, Now, there are two views on it, and I'm curious because there are enough students among us here today and many, many literature majors. Um, how do you think it informed your writing, or how did it improve it? Because y- your prose, I find, is immensely enjoyable. And if one gets into it, I personally think you're the master of the opening line in a book. I mean, Furies has the best opening line I have read in a very, very long time. I did want to ask you about it.
Well, I mean, I started taking it very seriously from a very young age. Reading and writing were always completely connected to me. So I was writing stories from 10, 11, 12. And even as a kid, when my friends and my parents would say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I always used to say, "I want to be a writer." And they'd always laugh, like this precocious little child. And I couldn't see what was so funny about it. I just felt very instinctively that this is what I was supposed to do. And so right through my teenage years, I was writing stories. I started getting some stories published. And so, yeah, I did an English degree in Trinity College in Dublin, in my, after school when I was 18. And then I did the master's in creative writing. And I do think that creative writing courses sometimes get a bad reputation. Nobody says anything bad when people go to film school or art school. And the mistake is that you don't go to creative writing classes to learn how to write. You go in order to be in a room with other people who are writing, to have, again, an audience, people actually reading your work and talking to you about it, but also kind of like a safe environment for a year where you can experiment with your writing, where you can learn so much from other writers, from student writers, but also from those who are teaching the class. And in the subsequent years, anytime I've taught on one of those classes, I still think you learn more from reading the other people's work and being able to go into the room and talk about it than you do about them reading yours. That's it's such an important part of it is the fact of just reading other people's work, recognizing what's working well in it, what is not working well in it, and being able to adapt that to your own writing as well. So I think it was a really important part of my life. Deadlines. It gives you deadlines as well. And again, when I've taught on the classes, I've always said to the students on them, once this year is over, you don't have those deadlines anymore. And so that's what's going to separate out the writers from the non-writers. Are you still going to be pursuing it? Are you going to write a novel, two novels that don't get published, and you'll still write the third one or the fourth one? That's what that's what makes a real writer.
Yeah. Um, and I'm squirming a little bit because, there are a couple of deadlines I have missed, but I think, to be fair, I've also continued. And I don't know how many of you feel the same way, but there are so many of us who kind of start and then feel after a couple of books that, is this all I have in me? And then to carry on. But thank you for that point on creative community and creative collaboration, because I think writing, like many art forms, is solitary, and a lot of people, whenever we talk about art, we forget how important community is. Community is extremely important to give us the feedback that we need to kind of hone our work.
Well, especially as novelists, because if you work in film, for example, you are working in a larger creative group, which can be very exciting. But novelists are working, it's a one man or one woman job, so you are spending so much time on your own that if you can make friends in the writing community, and if you can have a group like back in Dublin, for example, as I'm sure there is here in cities in India, back in Dublin, there's a group of writers, and some of whom get on, some of whom who don't, but that you'll always have your little gang of friends, maybe, who you can go out with and talk about what you're working on with and any difficulties you're facing, and support them as they support you.
So, on a personal note, John, you're openly gay. You've been a gay writer in Dublin, and I think it was not very different from India in the sense that homosexuality was decriminalized. I think pretty much in the 90s.
It was 1992 as well. I was in college. Yeah.
So 2018 here. And I just wanted to understand because, we do not want to talk about your other books as well. How did, how was it growing up as a gay writer
Um,
or as a young gay person at
well,
age?
probably as a gay person, it was so I was a teenager during the 80s when AIDS was at its peak, and I wrote about this in Heart's Invisible Furies. That so if you're like 14 and you're listening to people on the radio talking about something like AIDS and suggesting. I remember once, being coming home from school in my dad's car, and someone on the radio saying that all gay people should be put out onto an island, basically, so to stop infecting anybody else. And I grew up in a very Catholic country. It's kind of extraordinary that Ireland became the first country in the world to actually vote for equal rights marriage, in which we did in 2015, considering the history in Ireland of Catholicism. But I don't know. I mean, it wasn't easy, certainly, but I like told my parents, I told my friends I was gay pretty early, like around 20. I didn't see any reason to, I didn't feel any shame, and I didn't feel any urge to pretend to be something that I wasn't. And when I was 20, I wanted to have relationships, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. So I think I had some sort of inner strength inside me, which was helpful. It wasn't, funnily enough, it wasn't something I really wrote about, though, for many years. The Absolutist novel of mine from, I think, around, I don't know, 2011, maybe, was the first time I wrote a novel that had a gay character as the narrator. And it was set during the First World War. And that was 11 years into my publishing career, and probably, I don't know, 9 or 10 books in. But it's certainly a lot easier now, which is great, for kids growing up. Um, it's because kids today sort of are much more open and courageous, and that there isn't any sort of pressure on them in that sense. That their own peers are more welcoming of sexual difference. Anything away from the heteronormative is welcomed. Whereas in my day, it would have been a lot harder. It was a lot harder to have, I guess, to meet other young gay men or whatever. But you figure out how. Yeah.
How hard was it to be scathing about Catholicism as you have been in Furies, and there's so much um, passion. Um, it almost leaps off the page. And how much of it is you? How much of Cyril is
Oh, I mean,
you?
quite a lot of Cyril is me, even though he's a lot older than me. But I wrote when I wrote A History of Loneliness, which I think was around 2014, and that was the first book I wrote that was set in Ireland and that was specifically about the church. And what I realized that the way into it was not to be angry. That and to if you write something which is just pure rage, I don't know how fulfilling that is for the reader. That you have to find a more balanced way in as a novelist. So, I come from a generation of people, both boys and girls, who so many of whom suffered some form of abuse at school, myself included. And if I tried to write a novel like History of Loneliness when I was in my 20s, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I had too much rage inside myself. So what I needed to write about in that novel was not the priest who commits the criminal acts, but the priest who doesn't. That I wondered about those people who had devoted their life to the church, say, and had got to an older age and were being basically, uh, everybody just sort of assumed that you're one of them, one of those people who commits these crimes, and how that would be. But of course, once I got deeper into that novel, what I realized was that a small minority of priests committed those acts, but a wide majority knew about it and did nothing. And if there's one running theme going through all of my books, or through most of my books, it's complicity. And it's there in that. It's the people who know these crimes are taking place and do nothing about it. And we could go all the way back to striped pajamas and ask the same question of it. The people who know these crimes are taking place and do nothing about it, do nothing to stop it. Because that's the environment I grew up in Ireland in the 80s, where everybody knew what was going on in the schools and nobody seemed to put a stop to it. And it's baffling. It's baffling why they didn't. So when I came to Heart's Invisible Furies to write about, to more explicitly about what it was like growing up gay in Ireland, the church obviously plays a part in that, and society plays a part in that in the novel. And what I wanted to explore there was that how a country that had only decriminalized homosexuality in 1992 had, in the course of 23 years, gone to be the first country to vote for the equal rights marriage referendum, which is a blink
Which
of an
was
eye.
dramatic, which was really dramatic to say the least.
Yeah,
But
it's a blink of an eye in historical terms, 23 years, how that would happen. And when I look back at it, my answer to that question, I think it starts it starts at the beginning of the 90s with the election of Mary Robinson, who was our first female president in Ireland. And she was also the first president who was not part of the traditional ruling party. She was left wing. She was a woman, which, was just anathema to the ruling parties at the time. And she was just this breath of fresh air. And she came in and was president. And then we had people like Sinead O'Connor, who were using who was using her voice in the world when she became famous with Nothing Compares to You, and was willing to actually stand up to the patriarchy, um, and damage her own career by being heard and talking about what had happened to her when she was a kid, and refusing to be beaten down. And then the court cases started, one after another. And once they started, and it was like dominoes toppling, then the country just changed. And, between my late teens and my early 30s, Ireland just changed completely. And I would feel absolutely for the better. And it was thanks to people like Mary Robinson and Sinead and so many of those victims of abuse who are willing to stand up and go to the courts and go to the Gardaí and insist that their voice be heard.
it's quite a story in itself, don't you think? I mean, I wonder if there's going to be a Boyne novel someday about this, dramatic shift in Ireland, just as a fan.
Um, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I feel Hearts Invisible Furies has been that book for me. I don't see myself kind of going back to that really at the moment, but you never know. The thing is, as I'm sure there are so many writers here in the audience, you get a good idea and you say, "Oh, that will be it. I'll do that." Now.
talking about going back, I mean, the sequel, which actually, looking at the synopsis, you would never guess is is the sequel, um, is called All the Broken Places. Sorry for a
That's right.
blank moment. Um, and it's about Gretel.
Yeah.
I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but I'd love it if you spoke to all of us about it a little.
Well, it was April 2004 when I finished the first draft of Boyne the Striped Pyjamas. And before starting the second draft of it, I said to myself in my head, one day I will go back and I will write Gretel's story. Gretel being Bruno's older sister in that book. And through all the years between then and around 2020, I kept a file on my computer called Gretel's Story. And I would fill it with notes about ideas of who Gretel might be today, what might have happened to her in her life. You know, I leave her at the end of that story as a 12-year-old girl. We know what's happened to her brother. We know what's happened to her father. Her mother is basically, not talking to anybody. And she's a child. She isn't responsible for anything. And I always was interested in the idea of what it would be like to be a child of a commandant at a concentration camp and then to go through your life knowing that. The two sides of this story, on one hand, we have Bruno, who knows nothing and becomes a victim of the multitudinous crimes that are taking place there. And then we have Gretel. But I wanted to write it from today's perspective. So as I published a novel about 2 years ago, when the age that she would have been is 91 years old. So it can be a contemporary novel. So now rather than a 9-year-old, it's a 91-year-old. And having gone through life with this stain on you, with this weight of history, and knowing what your father has been responsible for, how you've had to run away from that your entire life. What does that do to your life? And I didn't know the answer to that question. And the way I answered that question is by writing the story itself, and figuring out who she is and what has happened to her. And even though it's quite a dark novel, through the first draft of writing that, I was very excited every day sitting down to write it because I was returning to this family who had been such a big part of my life and really discovering through the writing of it who she is and is she good, is she bad, is she somewhere in the middle? And it changed a lot as I wrote it. And in fact, all through those 20 years of thinking about her, she changed a lot in my head. But I think I think it was a good book to write. It's a book I'm very proud of, and I think has the right ending to the story of those characters.
So you're now working on your quartet,
Yeah.
and Water is out, although it's not yet out in India, as far as I can tell, because you can Kindle it, but I don't think you can buy it yet in bookstores.
Okay.
And Earth is coming out in May 2024. Um, and we know that they're interlinked and they're interconnected, but we'd love to know more about the Elements Quartet.
So it's four short novellas: water, earth, fire, air, the elements, and they're all standalone stories, but they're connected. A minor character from each becomes the narrator of the next one, and it works its way around in a big circle. But the overriding theme of the four books is, again, it's about abuse, about child abuse, and but looking at it from four different perspectives. So the first one, Water, is narrated by a middle-aged woman who travels to an island off the west coast of Ireland for a year. In the year previous to this, she's been part of a great scandal in Ireland. Her husband has been a swimming coach who's been convicted of crimes against 8 little girls. And it's been all over the media. It's been the big story of the year. So she goes to this island to ask herself, did she enable his behavior? Was she aware of it? She needs to understand this for herself. Was she, was she part of this without realizing it?
Was
So
she
she's,
complicit, as you said, that
yeah,
thread of complicity?
well, yes, and enabling very much is the thing there. And then in the second one, it's more a different story. It's about complicity. The third one, Fire, it's about a perpetrator, so the person who commits the acts. And then the fourth one, Air, it's from a victim's perspective. So looking at this in the round from four different ways, and I think this is the last, I think I've got it out of my system at this point. I've written so much about it. But it was interesting to write the four, and the third one was obviously the hardest because the third one is narrated by a person who is actually abusing children, but it's a woman who's abusing little boys. And it's very, very difficult to get your head into that space every day and to write it. And you also have to find a way that will make the reader want to know this story and want to stay with this character, despite all her heinous acts. And that one, like, really kind of was exhausting and difficult to write. Whereas the last one, which I'm literally working on at the moment, I was working on it earlier today, working on the second draft. From the victim's perspective, actually, I think is going to have a much more positive. I want to end on a positive note, because I want the victim to be the strongest character in all four, so that when you get to the end of that, you feel like a victim can survive and can say, you know what, I've dealt through this, I've worked my way through this, and I've got out the other side of it, and I'm going to be okay. And that's what I had to do in my life, and that's what I want my characters to do. So it's every 6 months for 2 years, and then they're all in hardback, and then we'll paperback them up in one book called The Elements.
It must have taken a toll on you.
It it has, to be honest, more than I expected when I set out to do it. I'm quite looking forward to getting to the end of it because my plan next is I want to write something funny, because there's so many dark things in the only funny book I've written is a book called The Echo Chamber, which was great fun to write because there's lots of jokes in it. And I just want to do that. I want to write some jokes next.
Yeah.
You know?
So the echo chamber, if one is to understand correctly, was your response to this huge fight in social media after your book called My Brother's Name is Jessica. Um, and then you decided, to sort of the best way to silence people or to have your say is to write a funny book. Perhaps. I mean, that's my guess. But tell us a little bit about the echo chamber as well.
Well, yeah, My Brother's Name is Jessica was a book that came out in 2019. And it was a book for young readers. And it was a book narrated by a 12-year-old boy whose older brother is transitioning into his older sister. And, if there is such a thing as an LGBT community, well, I'm part of it. So, I was writing a book which I hoped was, positive, kind, empathetic, compassionate. And then social media got its hands on it, or Twitter got its hands on it. And what was extraordinary to me was that the amount of people on Twitter who are not in any way connected to the story just attack, attack, attack. This is not going to be news to anybody. I mean, we know what it's like on social media. But I was astonished by it, by the vitriol, by the pure hatred. So I wanted to write about that. I wanted to understand why it had happened and my own response to it. And I thought the only way you can do this is through comedy. It's so ridiculous that you have to do it with jokes, and that if I had done it as a sort of a per me, the book would just be ridiculous, or just be no good. So I thought, just make it as extreme as possible. Just write about how Twitter and how social media invades our lives and why we take it so seriously and why people care so much to fight these ridiculous campaigns online that it like in activism is about going out and doing things, and when you go back to anything in Ireland or in India, it's about getting out onto the streets, protesting, doing something. It's not about sitting on your phone, attacking complete strangers. It's about going and doing something.
We'd love it if you read a little bit. And then I'm going to open this to questions. Do you have your reading time?
I don't. I left them in there, but it's okay. I'll figure it out.
I also have a Kindle with Furies on it where you can increase the font size.
Section.
And after that, questions. So
this is just a short section from the center of Striped Pyjamas. It's where Bruno meets Shmuel for the first time. The walk along the fence took Bruno a lot longer than he expected. It seemed to stretch on and on for several miles. He walked, and when he looked back, the house that he was living in became smaller and smaller until it vanished from sight altogether. During all this time, he never saw anyone anywhere close to the fence, nor did he find any doors to let him inside. and he started to despair that his exploration was going to be entirely unsuccessful. In fact, although the fence continued as far as the eye could see, the huts and buildings and smokestacks were disappearing in the distance behind him, and the fence seemed to be separating him from nothing but open space. After walking for the best part of an hour and starting to feel a little hungry, he thought maybe that was enough exploration for one day, and it would be a good idea to turn back. However, just at that moment, a small dot appeared in the distance, and he narrowed his eyes to try to see what it was. And while he was doing this, his feet were taking him step by step closer and closer to the dot in the distance, which in the meantime had become a speck, and then began to show every sign of turning into a blob. And shortly after that, the blob became a figure. And then, as Bruno got even closer, he saw that the thing was neither a dot, nor a speck, nor a blob, nor a figure, but a person. In fact, it was a little boy. Bruno had read enough books about explorers to know that one could never be sure what one was going to find. Most of the time, they came across something interesting that was just sitting there, minding its own business, waiting to be discovered, like America. Other times, they discovered something that was probably best left alone, like a dead mouse at the back of a cupboard. The boy belonged to the first category. He was just sitting there, minding his own business, waiting to be discovered. Hello, said Bruno. Hello, said the little boy. The boy was smaller than Bruno and was sitting on the ground with a forlorn expression. He wore the same striped pajamas that all the other people on that side of the fence wore, and a striped cloth cap on his head. He wasn't wearing any shoes or socks, and his feet were rather dirty. On his arm, he wore an armband with a star on it. When Bruno first approached the boy, he was sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at the dust beneath him. However, after he looked up, Bruno saw his face. It was quite a strange face, too. His skin was almost the color of grey, but not quite like any grey Bruno had seen before. Bruno was sure he had never seen a skinnier or sadder boy in his life, but decided he had better talk to him. I've been exploring, he said. Have you? Said the little boy. Yes, for almost 2 hours now. Have you found anything? Very little. Nothing at all. Well, I found you, said Bruno. So just leave it out, is that all right? Yeah.
Fantastic. Quite a treat, actually. I I do want to give it to you. Believe me, I do. I just want to ask you one question, John. Why do you call your writing room the ego room?
Oh yeah, so at my house in Dublin, I have a room at out the back of the house in the garden, and it's where I keep all the foreign editions, all the editions of my own books, and all the prizes and things that I've won. And I don't keep anything like that in the house. I keep other books, but I keep all my own things out there. So I call it the ego room. Yeah. So I go out there and I can look around and I say, well, this is what I did with my life. So
So, on that happy note, I'm going to open this out to the audience, and I know there's a whole bunch of you. Um, May we start with the lady in pink there? You had your hand up.
Hello, John. This is Anvesha. First of all, I want to say that I am a huge fan of Boyne Pajamas. It's one of the first books that I read in my life, and it still continues to be one of my favorites. Um, that ending really left me bawling my eyes out a lot many years ago. It still does have the same impact on me till today. So, what was going on in your mind when you actually wrote the ending? I really want to know that because it still shatters my heart into pieces. So, I want to know what it did to you. What impact did it leave on you, so that you could leave that impact on your readers? Thank
okay,
you.
you're welcome. Thank you for those kind comments. Well, I don't plan my novels in advance. I start writing them and I see where they take me. So I didn't know the ending of the book before I was about 2/3 of the way through when I figured out what the ending would be. And there's a moment in the book, if you'll remember, where Bruno gets lice, and so his father shaves his head. So then he looks more like Shmuel. And that's when it occurred to me that Bruno would go under the fence in and what would happen. It was very strange experience. I can remember it was the 30th of April, 2004. It was my birthday when I wrote the last few chapters of the first draft of the book. And it was as if the words were just pouring out of me. You know, I wasn't thinking. It was almost like automatic writing. and it felt so right to me. You know, I knew it was going to. It was a dark ending, a sad ending, but it felt like the perfect ending, and that the most important thing would be that they would be holding hands. And you know, when I met Mark Herman, who directed the movie, the first thing he asked me was, "If there's one thing you want to see on screen, what is it?" And I said, "It's the holding hands," because to me there is a moment of brightness within that darkness, because in some small way, Bruno and Shmuel have achieved a victory because they go down together, they're best friends for life, and that nothing can separate them. The hatred that surrounds them will not separate them. So, yeah.
In front, the lady in front. Everybody seems to be in pink.
Hello, welcome to our city. As all as with everyone, it's an amazing book, and the ending is obviously very poignant. But you mentioned that you did not intend this novel to be a historical document, but because it deals with such a sensitive wound in the corpus of humanity, where very atrocious crimes have happened, very unthinkable crimes have happened. Sometimes maybe the lines between authenticity and creative liberty of the author gets blurred in such historical fictions, because especially the Holocaust, where it's shown the human capacity to be inhuman. So in such cases, who do you think, and it goes to create a lot of controversies and criticisms, etc., because of this blurring. So who do you think the responsibility of making out the distinction lies on, the author or the reader?
That's a very good question. I think I think the author needs to know as much about the subject as he or she can before writing it, so that you can decide what's important for the story and what I can alter. And I became a student of the Holocaust around the age of 15. I became very, very interested in it. And between 15 and 31, 32, when I wrote the book, it was a subject I returned to time and time again. So I knew quite a lot about it. James Joyce said about grammar that if you know the rules of grammar, you can break them. And that's how I felt about the historical element to it. It's one of the reasons I put the word fable, though, on the front, because I wanted the reader. Um, uh, I didn't feel it was my place to write everything exactly as it happens. If that was the case, it would have to be a nonfiction work. So I do think the reader has some responsibility as well to understand that, to accept that, especially in schools. Now, I didn't write a school textbook, but it's used in a lot of schools, and I've gone into a lot of schools, and I always say to the children, this is not exactly as it was. This is just something to kind of trigger your interest. But I think if teachers are using it in schools, then I do think it's incumbent upon them to make sure that the children do understand that, and recognize that difference. In the same way that if a parent gives the book to a child, to understand that. But you see, the book became so much bigger than I ever expected, and I never expected 20 years later to be talking about it or having to, effectively justify it in some ways. I just thought, I was just writing a story that I thought would like move kids and might, get a few kids interested in it. And it became so much bigger than I had ever expected it to be. Um, but in a nutshell, I think it's a responsibility on both sides, the reader and the writer.
From the back now, I prefer some men. I've asked a couple of women fantastic questions. Um, in green there, there's someone there at the back. Yeah, at the back there. Your hand up. Yeah, blue shirt. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Uh, I saw the movie first, and then I came across with the book. So whenever a movie comes up, there is an official debate about which one is better, the movie or the book. So my question to you is, how satisfied were you with the movie, and what pros and cons did you think could have uh, been done to the movie itself?
Thank you. I thought it was a really good movie, actually. I thought it was a good adaptation. I think the best movie adaptations are the ones that aren't, completely enslaved to every page of the book, that can find a way to tell the story, but adapt it in a way. In the same way that, sometimes I'll get an email from a foreign language translator, and they can't translate a phrase exactly, and they have to find a way. So I was very happy with it. I had no issues with it, and um, there was a play and a ballet and an opera, and each person who adapted it brought their own ideas to it, and it doesn't change the book in any way. I remember the famous story about Louis de Bernier, who wrote Captain Corelli's Mandolin, and that was made into a film which wasn't very well received. And somebody saying to him, "Oh, they ruined your book," and he said, "Well, they did nothing to my book. My book exists. The film is an entirely different thing." So actually, I think it works really well for writers, because if the movie is good, the novelist gets a lot of credit for it, and if the movie's bad, you don't get any of the blame. So I was really pleased with it.
One more person. I mean, lots of hands are up. There seem to be the red hat. Okay, there seem to be more women than men, John. Yes.
Hi, my
Yeah,
name is
yeah.
Nikita.
One sec. The lady behind you.
No,
And
sure,
yeah, we
take
can
that.
both.
Then take that.
We'll take your
Yeah,
question. We take.
yeah, go for it.
Hi, my name is Nikita,
Hi.
and I'm a kindergarten teacher. So you mentioned that this book is for the youth, for young children to uh, introduce them as such. So, as since my job is to mold young minds, I have two questions regarding that. The first one being that what was your intention for children? Like, was it based on focusing on the Holocaust, or was it to focus on the concept of humanity that exists within the Holocaust? And contributing to it, the linking question would be that how do you think this could shape young minds, the future generation? And not just the future, like past, the present children, and the future who are just 3 year olds now, but are going to be growing up and reading these books.
Thank you. No, it was definitely the Holocaust was very much at the center of my thinking, as I said, because I had been so interested in it for so long. And it's such a big subject that I don't think it can stand as an analogy for anything else. I think it's its own story. So I did really want them to, in the same way that when I was like 14, 15, and I read Primo Levi for the first time, and that was my introduction. And that's what sort of sparked something in my head to make me interested. And I can remember going down to the library near my house and asking the librarian, I just read this, what should I read next? And being given Elie Wiesel to read. And it just, one book leads to another, to another, to another. And that's very much what I was thinking. And in terms of uh, their minds of their future and so on. Again, a thing I always say when I go into classrooms when we talk about this is I say to the kids, like one day you're the people who are going to be running the world. And it's up to you. You can read a book like this and say, why did these terrible things happen? How did they happen? How do we stop them happening? Well, everybody has a responsibility to do that. What do I do to make that happen? I write a book about it. What will you do when you're, you know, 30, when you're uh, running a shop or prime minister or whatever? What will you do in your life? Everybody has a responsibility to do it. So hopefully they will get something from that.
Right, the girl in the striped hat, and I think that's quite a fitting last question because I think we'll be out of time after this.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sharmishta and I'm a student of history. So, this novel is very close to my heart. It's one of the first historical novels that I read. So, I actually knew the story because I'd watched the movie first when I read the book, and expectedly, it left me numb even then. So, one thing that I wanted to ask is the last line, it struck me that not in this day and age. So, even today, we see that several genocidal intents are taking place across the world. Even the major example would be the Palestinians. So, anything that you would want to share on that about not in this day and age?
Uh, I'm not going to get into the Palestinians and Israel. I'm too smart to go down that road. But in the not in this day and age line, yeah, it was very much meant as an ironic statement that, as we know, genocides continue to happen. They, it's been the case since the start of time. War has been it's just always been there. I mean, and Europe, or I sorry, in Europe, we had the longest period of peacetime in European history until Russia invaded Ukraine and war again. Um, it was really an ironic statement at the end that we think the Holocaust is in the past. It's not in the past. Anti-Semitism is always around. It's always on the rise. Hatred, bigotry is always around. It never changes. It seems, disappointingly.
I think, John,
Okay.
John, you had also mentioned something which might, I don't know whether it answers your question or not, but in the book, you drew a parallel between a sense of victimhood and that eventually, leading to, horrific acts. Because there's this little bit that when Bruno's grandmother's there and they have this family gathering, there's the discussion about how, and the tutor comes in about how, you know, there was great injustice done to the German people, and Bruno was being taught that, and there's a pattern that we see today in the world where almost every time there's a cycle of violence, it begins with the narrative of victimhood and injustice.
Yeah, that's definitely in the book, and it's something which it would take a long time to debate and discuss that. What happened at Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, and all that. That you know ultimately probably led to, in time, to the Second World War. It's kind of a dark, deep note to it. I don't think we should maybe go.
Perhaps not.
So,
Perhaps not. One more question. You had your hand up
yeah,
for a very long time.
the man
Yeah, yeah,
down
yeah,
there has
yeah.
had his hand up
Yes.
for a long time. Yeah,
A
yeah,
mic.
yeah. The chap standing. Yeah, if there's a microphone to throw down to him.
Thank you. I'm Aranya Shinde. I'm from class 9, and I read this book when I was around 8 or 7 years old. So, at that young age, I had a different approach and a different kind of thinking towards this book. So, towards the end, what happens is that when Bruno crawls under the wires, he rolls in the mud, he has fun, and it's something he has never experienced in his life before. And I made it feel that in some sort of way, Bruno was feeling that he's free from the authority and all of the, I don't know how to say it, all of the authority around him. And Shmuel, in the end, when they both die together, he's free from the cruelty around him. So, in a way, can we call this book a story about freedom of two boys?
Yes, you can. And like I mentioned earlier that I like thinking about it as a book about friendship. These are two, all they want to be is kids. Like when they meet at that fence, and when they start playing games and throwing the ball over and back and playing drafts and stuff, they just want to be kids, and like it's that innocence which I think is really much at the heart of it. And I think when we think back to that time and the amount of children, particularly who died, within hours of arriving at the camps, it's horrific to think about. So when Bruno and Shmuel first meet, and as their friendship grows, what they see in each other is like an end to the isolation. For Bruno, the isolation, the loneliness of where he is. For Shmuel, it's for 5, 10 minutes every afternoon, he can pretend none of this is going on because he sees the truth of it every day. And he doesn't want to. He's just a kid, So in a way, I love bringing it down, as you just did, to kind of the really raw, simple, central theme of this, which is just these two little boys, two kids who just should be treated the same and should not be going through this traumatic experience. And in the reason I've written about war in young people's books quite a bit is because, of course, war does not distinguish between old people or children. It's the same. I don't know how many immigrants you've had here, perhaps from Ukraine. We've had quite a few in Ireland, and so many of them are just children that should not have to be uprooted from Ukraine and go and live in a different country because of things that are going on. And it's heartbreaking to say.
We're going to end on that note, except I'm going to ask John what he thinks about this audience. I thought you guys were spectacular. And of course, he's going to sign the books, and that's the bookstore, so you can go and get your copy signed by him.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. It's been a pleasure to do my first event here in front of you all. I wish I could have answered all your questions, but I'll see more of you in there, I'm sure. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Thank you very much.